It's great to have you with us here for the final, what I'm calling the pièce de résistance of what we've been doing today. We're really excited with the two guests who are going to be joining me on stage in a moment. Just to reiterate, this event, the whole of today, has been generously sponsored by Colson Bible Church. So again, if you're able to donate, do give them a round of applause. If you're able to donate anything as you leave, that would be generous. That would be gratefully accepted. But more than anything, we hope you've had a good day and that it's given you plenty to think about. I think there'll be plenty more as we go through the course of this evening. Just a reminder that I'm Justin Brierley. I host this faith debate show that broadcasts on Christian radio in the UK and around the world as a podcast. And so what we're going to be doing tonight is actually going to be recorded and broadcast on that radio show and the podcast in a couple of weeks' time. So you are going to be part of an international audience around the world who are taking part and listening and engaging with tonight's dialogue. So before I introduce my two guests for this evening, why don't we give our international audience a big Sequim welcome? Let's go for it. Woo! Yeah, good. It is an absolute pleasure to be with you here in Sequim. I was, when I first received this invitation, I started calling it Sequim. I don't know if I'm probably not the first person to make that mistake, but it's great to be in Sequim, to meet the people, and thank you so much for coming out tonight for this dialogue. If you would like to join me, Michael and Luke, do come up and take a seat. We've got a really interesting debate for you tonight. We're asking, are the miracles of Jesus unbelievable? I'm going to be giving some longer introductions to both my guests in just a moment's time, but Dr. Michael Shermer is well known as the founding publisher of Sceptic magazine, and we'll hear more about him in a moment's time. Luuk Vandeweghe, who I will also introduce at more length soon, is really the person who's brought together the whole of today. So Luke's done a wonderful job in bringing this all together. And really tonight is a really important debate, because at the end of the day, Christians or non-Christians, it all comes down to who was Jesus and did he do the things that the Bible claims he did? So that's a really important question, I'm sure you'll agree, for us to debate and discuss. There will be another opportunity for you to be involved. If you'd like to text any questions in during the course of the debate, then we'll try and include as many of those as we can in our kind of discussion time after we've heard from both Michael and Luke. So again, make sure you've got your program to hand. It's got the number on there to text. Do jot down any questions, text them in, and we'll try and include as many of those when we come to the discussion section as we can. The way this will work is that both Michael and Luke will give about a 20-minute presentation each from each of their different perspectives on this question of are the miracles. There, I'm back. Then we'll have two 10-minute rebuttals from each. Then we'll have some discussion time, and then we'll have some final summing up thoughts. So I hope you enjoy what we've got in store for you today. Let me first of all invite you, Michael, to take the stage. If you'd like to go up, what we're going to see from Michael is a little bit of a taster of what he gets up to via the art of video. So,
please welcome Michael Shermer. Why must things be debunked?
Because there's a lot of bunk. There's a lot of nonsense, bad science, voodoo science, pathological science, non-science, and plain old nonsense. It's all over the place.
Where's one of those probes from the dashboard?
I didn't say probe.
Where's one of
I
the
said physical
gadgets
trace
from
cases,
the
multiple
spacecraft?
witnesses.
It's no more mysterious, by the way, where you go after you die than where you were before you were born. Why does nobody get all fussed up about, well, where was I before I was born?
How can you tell the difference between, it's right or it's wrong? How do you know? What happens is you arrive at beliefs for non-rational, non-smart reasons, and then you back into it after the fact with rational reasons to justify it. We call this the confirmation bias.
Why would the aliens look like this?
Well,
these are
who drew that?
bipedal.
Who drew that?
Well, this comes from television.
And that kind of error, that false positive, that's superstition. That's magical thinking. That's assuming A is connected to B. It's a true pattern, and it isn't, and you're wrong.
Once that became the image of what aliens would look like, that's what people began to see in their dreams and their abduction experiences.
The point here is you want to have a mind open enough to accept radical new ideas, but not so open that your brains fall out.
The only way to tell, really, the difference between these true patterns and false patterns is science.
Really?
Yeah, really, yeah.
Most of the universe is just stars. All they're doing is converting hydrogen into helium under great pressure and heat. That's it. They're not sitting there thinking, I got to give Michael Shermer some purpose here because, you know, if I don't, he's going to kill himself or something. No.
The application of science and reason to solving political problems, economic problems, social inequalities, and so on. We're using reason to solve those problems rather than the witch theory.
Well, of course, students should be exposed to whatever the cutting-edge ideas are, and in science, that's what the best science is, and you have to be able to sell your ideas to other scientists in journals. You'd have to be barking mad to not think that the life is not designed. It is designed, but it's designed from the bottom up by a natural process of evolution. What intelligent design offers is not a scientific explanation. It's just a statement that we can't figure out how to explain this through science, so let's just say an intelligence did it. But that doesn't explain anything.
Science is the best tool ever devised for understanding how the world works.
The scientific method requires that we look for natural explanations for natural phenomena. There is no such thing as the supernatural or the paranormal. There's just the natural, the normal, and all the stuff we can't explain yet. And it's okay in science to just say, I don't know.
In that case, it's okay to just call bullshit.
Take the stage, if you would, Michael, and let's hear your opening statement.
Can you hear me now? How's
Yeah.
that? Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Came up from Los Angeles this morning, and when I heard there was a 2-hour drive from the airport to here, I envisioned the 405 in LA with the pack. And no, it's a beautiful drive. It's a beautiful part of the country. I've been to Seattle many times. I've been through Washington many times. I've ridden my bike 3 times from Seattle to San Diego in the 80s. So I know that, but I've never been up here. So this is really nice to see you all. And I'm not in the least bit squeamish about it. I know you've never heard that one before. Are the miracles of Jesus unbelievable? Yes. Thank you. Oh, did you want more? Yeah, okay. I'm not actually sure what I'm doing here. I'm pretty sure most of you are Christians, right? Just show of hands, how many of you call yourself self-identify as Christian, right? Okay, look at the time. No, I do appreciate, I tweeted this out to come on out to my skeptics friends up here, and I think a few of you came here, so thank you. I think there's very little chance I'm going to convert anybody here tonight to skepticism or whatever. It's not even what I do. Really, I'm just pro-science, pro-reason. I want to know what's true. I want to know the way the world really is. I've changed my mind on a great many things. So to me, it's, evidence counts, reason counts, and so forth. Miracle is a tricky one for scientists to think about. So I'm going to tell you how I think about it, how scientists think about miracles. And you can just draw your own conclusions. Just plant that in there. Just give it some thought. Now, most people think of a miracle colloquially, as in, it was a miracle that I won the lottery, or my cancer went away. It was miraculous. Or if you're a hockey fan and you remember the 1980 Olympic game when Al Michaels proclaimed at the end when the U.S. team was ahead of the Soviets and the clock ran out, "Do you believe in miracles?" Now, this is a usage of kind of intuitive, highly improbable events, but clearly not impossible. Sometimes sports teams finally win, like the Boston Red Sox or the Chicago Cubs or whatever. These things do happen statistically. You go to the phone to call your friend. You're just about to pick up the phone rings, it's your friend. Whoa, what are the chances of that? Admittedly, not good. But is it miraculous? No, because how many times did you go to the phone to call your friend? Your friend didn't call. How many times did your friend call? You weren't thinking about them. So when you add up all the possibilities, given enough time, the highly improbable will happen. Or given enough events. The law of large numbers tells us that highly unusual things will happen given enough possibilities. So, for example, just back of the envelope calculations, You're walking around reasonably alert in a 12-hour day. Let's say information is flowing through your senses into your brain about 1 bit per second, say use a computer analogy. Well, that's 43,200 bits of data per day, or 1.296 billion, or million, sorry, 1.2 million bits per month. Even if 99.999% of those were not particularly interesting, there was no unusual connection, that still leaves 1.3 miracles per month, or 15 miracles a year, by which I mean 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Okay, so we can't mean that. By the way, I also did this calculation for another query I often get about death dreams. You know, I had a dream last night that my grandmother died, and the next morning, my mom called and said, oh, Grandma passed last night. Oh my God, what time? About the time I had this dream. You know, what are the chances of that happening? That seems miraculous. Okay, so here's how a scientist would think about that. So we each average about 5 dreams per night. That's 1,825 dreams per year. Let's say you remember only 1/10 of your dreams, 1 out of 10. That means you're going to have 182 remembered dreams per year. Now, when I did the calculations, about 300 million Americans, so to say 300 million adult Americans dreaming every night, produces 54.7 billion remembered dreams a year. Now, sociologists tell us that we each know about, on average, 150 people reasonably well. So that makes a network grid of 45 billion personal relationship connections. And then I took the average annual death rate, all causes, all ages, at 0.008 is the death rate. That's 2.4 million Americans die every year, all causes, all ages. It is inevitable that some of those 54.7 billion remembered dreams will be about some of those 2.4 million deaths among the 300 million Americans and their 45 billion relationship connections. In fact, it would be a miracle if some death premonition dreams did not come true. Here is a show you will never see on television, next on Oprah, or Ellen. We have a woman who has these incredible death premonition dreams. So far, not one of them has come true, but stay tuned because this could be the one. Okay? So, of course, we only notice the ones that are highly unusual and connected. But if you do a calculation like that, you see that can't be what we mean by miracles, because they will happen without any divine intervention. Now, in the ancient world, miracles were all over the place. Pre-scientific biblical times, miracles were signs and wonders that applied to just about everything that happened, from the ordinary to the extraordinary, from normal births to virgin births, from rain to deluges, from famines to feasts. Clearly, this will not suffice either, because if everything is a miracle, then nothing is a miracle. If God just performs miracles every 5 minutes, then nothing's going to particularly stand out. There's no natural law that's just grinding away, and God periodically dips into the world to stir the particles to make something happen. It's just happening all the time. So that's not going to quite cut it. Let me introduce you to David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment philosopher who wrote the first modern treatise on miracles in his book the section is called On Miracles, in his book on knowledge and reason. He defined a miracle as a violation of a law of nature, or a transgression of a law of nature by a particular volition of the deity or some invisible agent. In other words, a miracle is an event caused by God. So it has to be highly improbable, so that it's not happening every 5 minutes. I mean, if God healed every cancer patient, then there'd be no cancer, there's no miracle. So it can't be that. It's got to be highly improbable. But not just highly improbable like the phone call or the death dream. It's got to be something else, some intervention into it. Now, Hume asks, this is the only long passage I'll read from a philosopher, because these guys didn't write all that clear in the 18th century, these long paragraph sentences. Anyway, so he asks himself, the plain consequence is, and it's a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. When anyone tells me he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or the fact that which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, And according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. If the falsehood of his testimony would be more miraculous than the event which he relates, then, not until then, can he pretend to command my belief or opinion, end quote. Okay, so here's what he's saying in my own calculation. Okay, so there's about 7.5 billion people alive today. How many people have ever lived? Well, demographers have given us a fairly reliable number. You take it back to about 50,000 years ago or so when our species had migrated around to most places around the earth. About 100 billion people have lived and died before us. 100 billion. Not one has come back from the dead. Or maybe one. In this room, one. So, what are the chances that 100 billion to 1 miracle happened? Or that the stories we heard about, none of us saw it happen, that the stories we've heard, told from stories, from other stories, from eyewitnesses who told other people, or allegedly eyewitnesses and so on, are right? Which is the greater miracle? Now, Hume said, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. This is another way of saying, as Carl Sagan put it so poignantly in his Cosmos series, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Is the evidence for miracle stories from history commensurate with the evidence? I say no. I say it's far more likely that the stories people tell, they've misperceived, they've exaggerated, you tell the story over and over and over, it grows in size. We all are familiar with the whispers game. I whisper to you, you whisper here, and all of it. By the time it gets to the back, it's a completely different story. We know how that works. And since Hume's time, we know that human memory is, from research in cognitive psychology, is not reliable. There's no video recorder up there that you play back the video on the theater, the screen of your internal theater. No such thing like that. You know, memories are constantly edited and changed. You have memories of memories of memories. You have a memory of your 5th birthday from when you were 10, when your mother told you about your 5th birthday when you were 10, when you were 15, and the photographs and this and that and so on. There's no perfect recording of your 5th birthday or any other memory like that. It's a constantly edited process. Now let's look at some of these miracles that we're interested in talking about. As you know, about 2,000 years ago, a remarkable man was born in a remote part of the Roman Empire. A supernatural being informed his mother that the child she was to conceive would not be a mere mortal, but would be divine, and she gave birth to him in a miraculous way. As a young man, he left home and went on an itinerant preaching ministry, urging his listeners to live not for the material things of this world, but for the spiritual. This man collected disciples around him who came to believe he was the Son of God. And he did miracles to prove his divinity. He healed the sick, he cast out demons, and he even raised the dead. For these miracles, he was persecuted by the Roman authorities, and at the end of his life, he ascended to heaven. Later, some of his followers wrote books about him. I am speaking, of course, about Apollonius of Tyana, the pagan philosopher contemporaneous to Jesus and widely known in his own day. In fact, it was said of his biographer, who wrote a couple decades after his life, that there were debates between the followers of Jesus and the followers of Apollonius, arguing over who was the true Son of God. And these are not the only miracle-working sons of God in the ancient world. There were, in fact, a number of them. Most people at the ancient world were polytheists. It was not at all unusual for gods to come to earth, for gods to have sex with human females, and offspring are half deity, half human. Or people die and they go to heaven and become deities. This was common knowledge at the time. Here's what the early church father Justin Martyr said when defending what he believed about Jesus to the Romans. When we say that the Word, who is our teacher, Jesus Christ, the firstborn of God, was produced without sexual union, and then he was crucified and died, rose again and ascended to heaven, we propound nothing new or different from what you believe regarding those you consider the sons of Jupiter, Jupiter was the supreme Roman deity. In other words, this was fairly common, as were many of the biblical miracles. Miracle floods were common amongst people that lived on large bodies of water that, flooded periodically, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the Noachian flood story by several centuries. Miracle virgin birth myths were also common. Among those alleged to have been conceived without the usual assistance of the male lineage were Dionysus, Perseus, Buddha, Attis, Krishna, Horus, Mercury, Romulus, and of course, Jesus. Consider the parallels between Dionysus, the ancient Greek god of wine, and Jesus of Nazareth. Both were said to have been born of a virgin mother, who was a mortal woman, but were fathered by the King of Heaven. Both allegedly returned from the dead, transformed water into wine, introduced the idea of eating and drinking the flesh and blood of the Creator, and to have been the liberator of mankind. Even resurrection myths were not that uncommon. Osiris is the Egyptian god of life, death, and fertility, and is one of the oldest gods from whom records have survived. Osiris first appears in the pyramid texts about 2400 BC, by which time his following was already well established. Widely worshipped until the compulsory repression of pagan religions in the early Christian era, Osiris was not only the redeemer and merciful judge of the dead in the afterlife, he was also linked to fertility, most notably, and appropriately for the geography, the flooding of the Nile and the growth of crops. The kings of Egypt themselves were inextricably connected to Osiris in death, such as when Osiris rose from the dead so that they would in union with him, and so forth. Joseph Campbell wrote a book about this called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is a very common hero journey. You go out into the world, you face challenges, you grow, you learn, you come back and salvage your people. This has a lot to do with oppression and redemption. I call this the oppression-redemption myth. It's very common in history. Fast forward 1,800 years to upstate New York. A man by the name of Joseph Smith claimed that the angel Moroni visited him and told him that there were gold plates buried near his backyard in Palmyra, New York. Now, according to Joseph Smith, 11 of his, shall we call them disciples, saw these gold plates. If you look on the first page of the Book of Mormon, it's an affidavit signed by these 11 guys saying, yep, we saw the gold plates. Now, the gold plates were chiseled in this ancient hieroglyphics that had to be translated into English. How he did this, if you don't know the story, he had these seer stones, these kind of stones you could sort of see through. He put them in his hat. He put his face in his hat, and he translated these gold plates into the Book of Mormon. Among other things, he believed that Jesus not only was resurrected as our Savior, but that before he ascended to heaven, he stopped by America. And he visited the Lamanites and the other group, the Nephites and the Lamanites, who were part of the lost tribes of Israel. This story goes on and on and on. If you really want to get it fully, go see the Book of Mormon. It's one of the best musicals you'll ever see. It's so good, the Mormons themselves buy advertising in the playbook for the opera, for the musical. It's very accurate what they believe. Now, as crazy as this story sounds, all right, to our modern ears, I argue it's no less improbable than any of the other stories, including the Jesus story. We can continue on with these. In the 1890s, on the plains in North America, there arose a divine savior, a Paiute Indian named Wovoka, who during a solar eclipse and fever-induced hallucination received a vision from God with all the people who had died long ago engaged in their old-time sports and occupations, all happy and forever young. It was a pleasant land and full of game. Wovoka's followers believed that in order to resurrect their ancestors, bring back the buffalo, and drive the white men out of the Indian lands, they needed to perform a ceremonial dance that went on for hours and days at a time. This became the famous 1890 ghost dance, and the federal government, the United States, was not amused. These Indians were not staying on their reservations. They sent out troops, and you all know the tragic ending to this at Wounded Knee, and that was the end of the Native American culture at that time. Around that same time that Wovoka was resurrecting the dead in North America, another spiritual guru and saint, who millions of people believed him to be the incarnation of God, was performing miracles in another part of the globe. Miracles witnessed by and attested to by millions of people, including his ability to levitate, read minds, perform exorcisms, cure the dying, and even raise the dead. I'm talking about Shirdi Sai Baba, the Indian spiritual guru, saint, and fakir who many millions of Hindu and Muslim believers today believe is the incarnation of the Lord Shiva. October 13th, 1917, Fatima, Portugal. 50,000 people saw a cosmic miracle of the sun, during which the sun began to spin wildly and tumble down to earth, radiating indescribably beautiful colors. This was attributed to the Virgin Mary. Now, you all know the story that 500 people witnessed Jesus after his death. 500 is nothing. This is 50,000 saw this. Do you believe that the Virgin Mary came to Fatima, Portugal, and made the sun stop and tumbled down to the sky? I trust there's not a lot of Catholics here. I have a Catholic joke coming up, so make sure. Of course you don't. Of course you don't believe this. It's your thoroughly modern thinkers, your critical thinkers, your skeptics like me. 1984, 1,000 people saw the Virgin Mary appear near a waterfall in Betania, Venezuela, including doctors, lawyers, psychologists, and psychiatrists. Okay. Let me just wrap this up here, and then I'll have a few more comments along these lines in my 10-minute rebuttal. So you're all as skeptical as I am on these things. No? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we have much to discuss tonight then. Well, let me ask you. If I told you that the bolognese sauce I put on my pasta last night, after I sprinkled some Latin phrases over it, was the blood and body of Jesus, and that I consumed this as part of my ritual, you would think I'd lost my mind, right? But if I did this with wine and a cracker, you'd say, oh, Shermer, he's a Catholic. What's the difference between the bolognese sauce and the wine and the cracker and some pasta, all right? You're skeptical of the one, but not the other, but why? Well, you're used to the one. The one has a long, deep history reaching back into the mists of time. You don't see how it unfolded. The Mormons, you can kind of see how that unfolded. Not buying it. Scientology, that's too recent. We know exactly what happened. That's not likely to make a world religion. That's the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much. Yes, do take a seat, Michael. So thank you very much. So Luke is going to take this stand now. Let me just give a brief introduction to Luke. No show reel for you, Luke, but I can say that Luke is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He holds graduate degrees in theology and biblical studies, and his recent work accepted for publication in the Bulletin for Biblical Research. Luke has debated other popular atheists on issues of faith, reason, and the historicity of Christian truth claims. You can find some of Luke's debates online. But Luke, we look forward to hearing your case for the biblical miracles of Jesus.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Michael, for that opening statement. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It isn't just any story. It's a story that happened in history. It's a story about those people who actually knew Jesus in person, those who walked with Jesus, those who followed Jesus, those who saw Jesus perform miracles, those who experienced a radically unique person and changed everything they believed from what they learned growing up. Right? This is the one message I want to communicate to you tonight, the one thing. This is what I want you to remember. They weren't liars, and they weren't fooled. I will show you an unbroken chain of evidence, right? We'll work backwards. It's going to end with the trial of Jesus, but it begins in a garden party in Nero's palace. Now here's a picture of Tacitus. Tacitus is a first century Roman historian, not a Christian, right? He writes histories for the Roman Empire. And because Christianity is a part of that history, he writes a little bit about Christians. Tacitus paints a picture of what it's like to be a Christian in AD 66. There was this crazy guy named Nero, the Roman emperor. He loved to take Christians, nail them to crosses, and burn them to light his garden parties. Now, this is AD 66. In other words, the time between this garden party and when Jesus lived is about the difference between today and the debut of the Oprah Winfrey Show. In other words, it's certainly within living memory, right? Now imagine you are in the Colosseum in Rome in AD 66. Before you is your child, or maybe it's your mom or your friend. You told them about Jesus, someone you experienced, or perhaps you believed in Jesus because of the testimony of Peter, right? Someone who knew Jesus. Or perhaps this person before you, your family member, is being killed because they knew Jesus, or they knew one of the early apostles, right? You're watching them being covered in the skins of beasts. Why? So that they can be torn to death before your eyes by wild dogs. That's literally what Tacitus tells us the Romans did to Christians around this time. Now, all you have to do to save your child, this person that you love, is to get up, right? Say, hey, this isn't true. It's just an ancient mythology, right? It's not real. That's all you have to do. Just get up and say, it's a lie. I'm the person who convinced this individual to do this. I knew Jesus. He wasn't who I said he was. But you know what? Tacitus tells us Christians gain the sympathy of the people because they never did this. They suffered, they endured, and they won over the hearts of Rome during that era because they never went back on their testimony. Early martyrs weren't liars, right? And they weren't fooled. I mean, perhaps they had known Jesus, like I said, eaten the bread of the 5,000 that Jesus multiplied. Perhaps they'd known Jesus' brothers. We'll talk about one of those in a little bit. Peter ministered in Rome for several decades. They likely would have known Peter. But at this time, in AD 66, while these Christians are burning in Nero's garden, Peter isn't there. Why? Well, in AD 66, Peter is already dead. Let's back up 2 years to AD 64. Standing before you is a man. He's being lifted up to be crucified. People were most of the time crucified naked. Right? Crucifixion is one of the most shameful, horrendous deaths ever invented by mankind. Crucifixion kills you slowly through suffocation. Crucifixion is what inspires our word excruciating. Right? That man before you is Peter. Now, according to all the earliest sources we have, Peter is the man who inspired Mark write his gospel. In other words, the words in the Gospel of Mark are largely the words inspired by the Apostle Peter in his early preaching. Right? Well, what does the Gospel of Mark say about Peter? I mean, who here has read the Gospels? Good, we got a bunch of Christians. Good, you read your Bible. Good. Does it paint Peter as this awesome guy? But Peter's an idiot, right? He always says the wrong thing at the wrong time, right? Now, if you were Peter, right, why would you make up a gospel that talks about you like that, and then as a reward, die in excruciation, one of the worst deaths ever invented by mankind? Why would you do that? Well, maybe because Peter wasn't a liar. Mark's gospel from Peter is actually one of the earliest accounts we have of Jesus. What is the Gospel of Mark filled with? Miracles. 40% of Mark's Gospel are miracle accounts. This is the key. That is the story Peter died for. Now, was Peter a guy who was in a position to know if that story was true, if it really happened? Of course it was. Peter was part of the inner circle. He couldn't have been fooled. Now, Peter, sure, no scientist, right? He wasn't a scientist. This is a pre-scientific age, but Peter wasn't an idiot. Realize Peter's probably seen more dead people than any person in this room, right? Probably more than Dr. Sean George, who's seen individuals die on his table in the hospital many times, right? During this era of history, women had to have like 6 children just to keep the population going. In other words, Peter knew what dead people looked like. Peter knew something about dead people. They generally stay dead, right? You don't have to have a doctorate to know that. You don't have to be a scientist to realize, hey, a few loaves of bread doesn't feed 5,000 people. Cripples don't get healed instantly. Blind people don't suddenly see again. But Peter met somebody, not just anybody, not just any regular guy that's ever lived, somebody named Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus, before his eyes, instantly, completely, and publicly healed people. And Peter changed everything he thought about reality because of that experience. And he died in excruciation without ever denying it was true. Now, Chuck Colson was the guy who he worked under Nixon. He went to prison, actually, for the Watergate scandal. And I really like what Chuck Colson says about this. He says, I was involved in this scandal that it involved 12 of the most powerful men in the world. And you know what? They couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. That's it. All right. You're telling me 12 apostles can keep alive for 40 years and die for that? Chuck Colson says, I don't care what David Hume says. That is impossible. Right? They weren't liars, and they weren't fooled. Let's go back to the cross. And there's Peter before you. Let's zoom out a little bit. Right? In the crowd, there's somebody watching. Right? This is a plausible scenario I'll paint for you. He's a traveler. He's a close companion of a very good friend of Peter named Paul. He's watching Peter die. Right? This is not this guy's first experience. In fact, this person traveled around with Paul throughout the Roman Empire as Paul was stoned, beaten, persecuted, and eventually put in prison for preaching about Jesus. Now, Luke watched many of his friends suffer, right? What did Luke do? Well, he wrote history. Luke is a doctor. He's an investigator. Luke is actually a top-notch historian. He goes around and he interviews Mary, Jesus' mother, all these individual disciples who followed Jesus. In fact, if you go through the Gospel of Luke, oftentimes you'll see a miracle account. It's got someone's name there. And now if Luke followed typical historiographical practices, every indication is that he did. Likely many of those individuals are the informants. They are the sources of what he's telling you. He interviews everybody he can find. This is what he himself says. And you know what? They all said the same thing. Jesus did this. Jesus performed miracles. Right? Luke's investigation provides this unbroken line of evidence. It spans over 50 years from the birth of Jesus to his ministry to his martyrdom and the martyrdom of those who followed him. Let me give you a taste of Luke's accuracy as a historian. Here's a map of AD 59. Right now, Luke in the book of Acts, he travels around with Paul. So that's when he meets all the early apostles, and he's traveling with Paul. Paul gets involved in an unfortunate voyage and a shipwreck on his way to prison. Right? And during this shipwreck, Luke recounts the journey. Luke mentions 7 tremendous facts. For example, he mentions they're on an Alexandrian grain ship. He correctly identifies its size, its route, the kind of ship that it is. Right? Beyond that, Luke recounts all kinds of what we call in Greek, hapax legomena. These are unique names only found in this particular text. Why are they unique? Because they're nautical terms. Right? They're not just nautical terms, But the third point beyond this is that they're actually Latinized Greek words. Well, why would that be? Because we now know those individuals who would have been involved with Luke would have gone on this kind of route, would have ended up in Rome. Well, these ships were owned by private contractors in Rome, and the sailors would be Roman. So that explains kind of the Latin jargon they had. Luke gets all the winds correct compared to the distances that they travel. Right? Now, at some point in time, Luke recounts there's a small island named Cauda. This is significant. Luke is the only ancient historian who gets the location of this island correct. Yet other guys who are geographers, Pliny the Elder, Ptolemy, they're about 90 miles off. Luke is the only guy who correctly locates this island. There's a guy who was a scholar, he was a sailing expert. In the 1800s, he went around and he tried to mimic Luke's routes, the kind of winds he would be in, the kind of ship he would have had. And he took this trip from Crete to Malta, which is where Paul was shipwrecked. And given the conditions that he estimated and the winds that he figured for Luke's journey, it took him 13 to 14 days. Well, how long does Acts 27 tell us it took their journey? 13 days. This, what Luke recounts, is the most meticulous, accurate voyage and shipwreck of all antiquity. Luke is a first-rate historian. Meticulous, thorough, careful, accurate. But once again, and this is the thing I'm getting to with all of this. What is the stuff of Luke's message? What is the stuff? What is that thing his closest friends are out there dying as they proclaim it? Why does he watch them die? Why does he watch them suffer? Because of the miracles of Jesus. Right? You know, and Luke, he doesn't get anything back for writing all this. He doesn't get any medal. He doesn't get any honor. His only prize is truth. Luke wasn't a liar, and he wasn't a fool. That's my point. You know, Luke tells us about something else. He tells us about an individual named James. Now, a Jewish historian named Josephus also mentions James. Josephus, to give you a little bit of context. How am I doing on time, Justin?
You've got another 6 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
I went 22 if you want to.
Yeah, maybe 7, 8.
8, 9, 10. All right. Let me give you a little bit of background then about Josephus. Josephus is also a first-century historian. He's a Jewish historian who writes on behalf of the Roman Empire. My point being, he is not biased toward Christianity. Right? Josephus also tells us James is stoned. Right? To give a little bit more context, we can take in all of our earliest sources together. James wasn't just stoned, but as was the customary practice for those who were incredibly antagonistic to the Jewish leadership, they took him to the pinnacle of the temple and they pushed him off. They threw him off the building. Then they stoned him and beat him to death. This individual was called James the Just. Why? Because James was balanced. He was a leader. He was clear-headed. In fact, he was once a skeptic about the miracles of Jesus. But James came to believe Jesus was God in the flesh. He worshiped Jesus. This guy died for Jesus. James thought Jesus was the perfect, sinless, universal way that anybody could be forgiven. Right? But one more minor detail about James. James was Jesus' brother. Now, let me stop now. Think about your brother. Right? Many of you got brothers in here, okay? If your brother wasn't sinless, don't you think you'd know that? Right? You would know that, wouldn't you? Now, imagine now this is you. You're about to be thrown off a building. It's going to get real squishy on the way down, right? Not the way you want to go down, no pun intended, right? You only have to do one thing, not to endure that kind of horrendous death. You just have to deny that your brother is the sinless, miracle-working Son of God. That's it. James never did that. He never did that. He could not have been fooled. Clearly, he wasn't a liar. Right? What do we do with that then? Now realize this. Those who threw James off that building also likely knew Jesus. I mean, they certainly knew Jesus' disciples are throwing one of them off a building. Right? In fact, this particular group who killed James also killed Jesus. Let's go back to the trial of Jesus. I want to read a portion of the Babylonian Talmud. This is a compilation of sacred traditions coming from the ancient Jews. This particular text, according to a rabbinic expert out of Cambridge, goes back to Jesus' trial around 80-30 or 33. This is the summary chart of Jesus of Nazareth from his Jewish enemies. On the eve of Passover, they hung Jesus for sorcery and for enticing Israel. And notice the word sorcery there. Jewish rabbis were actually quite sophisticated in distinguishing illusion or magic from supernatural. They would never kill somebody. In other words, it was not a capital offense to be an illusionist, right? Or to be able to perform minor works of magic. This word, sorcery, implies supernatural power, right? Now that's very embarrassing for them, because this means that they believed something about Jesus. They killed him for it, that he had supernatural power. And this is the remarkable thing, because it means, going back to James, that the man they were throwing off that temple, James, Jesus' brother, and the men whose hands grabbed hold of him to cast this man to his death, actually both believed the same thing, that Jesus was capable of performing miracles. Now that's very weighty, isn't it? If they can believe that, those who were the closest to know, those who believed it so much they killed and died for it, if they can believe that, certainly it's reasonable for me to believe that. If they can believe it, so can I. And let me add some context, perhaps. I have a few minutes left, Justin.
You've got 2 or 3 minutes.
Let me add some context to how weighty and unique this evidence is. And I'm going to bring my first witness up, and it's going to be someone you're familiar with now, Apollonius of Tyana, right? Realize I'm familiar with this story because this is the guy everybody brings up who's skeptical, right? Because he's the best parallel to the historical Jesus that we have. Now realize there's only one problem. In the area where it really matters, evidence, early evidence, weighty evidence, the difference between Jesus and Apollonius is worlds apart. For Apollonius, we have one source. One source. 150 years later. Jesus and Apollonius were supposed to live at the same time. The earlier source that we have from Apollonius is towards the end of the 2nd century. By the way, Philostratus, that's the name of the author who writes this source, also talks about fire-breathing dragons over in India and stuff. It's not a particularly credible story. But you know what's the most interesting is that Philostratus, he didn't die for this, of course, right? He was paid for it. Now, why was Philostratus paid to write about Apollonius? Well, he was paid by a pagan empress. And you know what? Why she wanted him to write it? Because she was sick of the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Now, if any source borrowed from another, which way do you think that went? Right? If anything, Apollonius is a witness to how strong the evidential basis is for Christianity, because the best alternative that the opposition can come up with is obviously a historical counterfeit. Right? Or let's think about Josephus, for example. I've argued tonight that the earliest disciples, they weren't liars and they weren't fools. Let's think about Joseph Smith, Let's think about Joseph Smith. That document that Michael referred to with the 11 individuals who signed that, well, some minor problems with that. For example, one of those 3 guys, Martin Harris, claimed he saw the golden tablets with a spiritual eye. It's kind of nice to have these babies when we're talking about miracles, right? Minor detail. Also, the earliest 3 witnesses were actually excommunicated by Joseph Smith because Joseph Smith thought they were a bunch of liars. Now let's talk about Joseph Smith for a moment. This is going to sound harsh. Joseph Smith is a treasure-hunting liar, right? The guy he went out publicly and spoke against polygamy, for example, right? But he had 27 wives ranging from age 14 to 78. Now, anyone who thinks he can hide 27 women is a fool and is a liar, right? And if that's some of the best alternatives we have to Jesus, that to me, it shows us, hey, maybe there is extraordinary evidence here. Maybe it's weighty. Maybe it's believable. Maybe you should take it seriously tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luke. And for his 10-minute rebuttal, let's hear from Michael.
Well, thank you. That was all very interesting. Let me make a comment on this story about Luke. First of all, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, most biblical scholars don't think there were 4 authors named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were names given to the books by the anonymous authors. That's what most biblical scholars, not all, but most biblical scholars think. Mark was most likely written first, around 65 to 70. Then Matthew and Luke, and then John, about 95. John is quite different from the other 3. We'll get to that maybe in the discussions. But let's just take whoever Luke was. He was an accurate historian, navigated around the Mediterranean, accurately described what he did, where he went, found this island more accurately than anybody else, and so forth. It is my contention that that's largely irrelevant when you're talking about the description of a highly unlikely, highly improbable divine event, which is how I define a miracle. So, for example, I mentioned earlier I came up here from LA. I live in Santa Barbara. My flight was canceled this morning, so I got to sleep in an extra hour, and then had a connecting flight through San Francisco, landed at SeaTac. My friend Bob picked me up. We drove south on the 5, jumped over through Tacoma, went across that Narrows Bridge that crashed back in the 30s or whenever it was. That was pretty exciting, but we made it across there, went up through these little fishing villages, and then we were on Highway 19, I think, and then Highway 104, and then 101. And right at the junction of Highway 104 and 101, a bright light hovered over our car, and we were abducted by aliens into a spaceship that took us to the Pleiades, where I met the Pleiadians, who told me about what we need to do to save the Earth. They brought us back through the miracles of time travel. We didn't lose any time, and we had time for dinner. We ate at that restaurant at the wharf nearby here, the John Wayne thing on the lake, whatever. Yeah, it was great. Had the bouillabaisse, drove here I am. Now, that's an accurate description, most of it, of what really happened. Are you buying the abduction part? No, of course not. All right? You don't need a lot of evidence that the rest of the story is probably accurate, because it's typical. It's not unusual. It's not an extraordinary claim, so you don't need extraordinary evidence. You know the highways I just called out. You can picture it. Yeah, he probably did that. The abduction part, not so much. Why? Because it's an extraordinary claim. Aliens are not just popping in and out all the time. We never see them. So, Shermer, you need to provide extraordinary evidence for that extraordinary claim. Well, but my friend Bob was there. He saw it too. Bob, right? And anyway, you get the idea. Of course, I just made that up as an example. That alone is irrelevant. Now let's talk about the suffering. Now, crucifixion was designed to make the victims suffer as long as possible before they died, although sometimes they broke their legs so that they would die sooner from not being able to breathe. But really, I don't think the Romans had anything on the medieval Inquisition. If you've ever looked at their instruments of torture, they were designed to do just that, make the victim suffer for as long as possible without killing them, and then kill them. So capital punishment in medieval Europe designed and implemented by the Christians of the time. Part of the Inquisition was to make them suffer as long as possible. The suffering part is really not that unusual by historical examples. Lots of people go to their deaths believing so strongly in another person, a cause, a belief, an ideology, that we can just rattle them off. Jim Jones, David Koresh, Charles Manson, I mentioned Shirdi Sai Baba, Shoko Asara, Shariko cult, Marshall Applewhite, Joseph DeMambro, Muhammad Atta. Muhammad Atta? You know who that is? The hijacker who flew American Airlines plane into the World Trade Center. I am quite confident his moral module was dialed up to 11, believing he was doing the most just and moral thing a human could possibly do, and he was going to be rewarded in heaven. 72 virgins, etc. Okay, you know the story. People do this, absolutely. They'll suffer for their, and it doesn't even have to be believing in God. There are atheist, Marxist revolutionaries in the 70s who gladly died in the name of this ideology. People do this. It's insane, but they do. We're trying to understand it from a psychological point of view, why people do that. But the idea that, well, our guys that support our belief, they did that. So what? Lots of people do that. That's not evidence. Speaking of Muhammad, the other one, if you're impressed with the numbers of people that have been moved by Jesus' life, over 2 billion in the world today, it's impressive, to be sure. But there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today. They will surpass Christians in about the year 2050, 2060, depending on fecundity rates and so forth. So the numbers are also irrelevant, because I presume most of you here, you raised your hands being Christians, so you're not Muslim. But Muslims believe that Muhammad performed numerous miracles. They attest to it. There was eyewitnesses. People said they saw it. They signed documents to support it. So he split the moon. Boom, split the moon. Caused blindness to some warriors who were assembled at his door to assassinate him. He caused the horse of an enemy pursuing him to sink into the mud. Before the Battle of Badr, he accurately predicted where the enemy chiefs would be killed. He quenched the thirst of thousands of his soldiers. He caused 2 trees to move at his command. Be handy if you're gardening. He caused a barren ewe to produce milk. He caused it to rain during a drought in Medina. Stones and trees would greet him during his prophethood. He could understand the language of animals. He did not cast a shadow. He could hear the voices of the dead in their graves. He could heal the sick and cure the blind only by touching the patient. And of course, most famously, he flew on a winged horse from Mecca to Jerusalem and then to heaven. He apparently did not stop by America on the way. Okay, so, crazy, right? But that's what 1.5 billion people believe. Now, he wasn't claiming to be God or the Son of God. He's the last prophet. Unless you're Mormon, then you have Latter-day Saints and more prophets. And unless you're Scientology, and you get one more. And so it goes. Now, if you think this is different somehow, it's not. If you were an anthropologist from Mars, you come to study the beliefs of humans, and you didn't know the names of these things. Just here's one set of beliefs, here's another set of beliefs, here's another. Which one's the right one? All of the arguments I just gave you, they're indistinguishable. I mean, yes, they're different, of course. The details are different. But in the main, there's no one that stands out as like, well, that's the accurate one, and these are all a bunch of baloney. You have only to ask yourself, why don't Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah, as this miracle worker? Same book, well, the Old Testament anyway. They believe in the same God that you believe in. Almost always lumped in the same name, Judeo-Christian. Judeo-Christian. They don't. They don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. They know all the arguments. You can't say, well, those crazy Jews. Well, Christians used to say that. That thankfully stopped in the 20th century. But And you can't say, well, they don't really know the arguments. If they knew the arguments, they'd convert. No, they know the arguments. The great rabbis, these are super smart, well-educated, intelligent people. They know the arguments. Their version of the Messiah in the Old Testament is not somebody who's captured and crucified. It's a triumphant warrior who becomes the leader of Israel. You might say it's almost a Trumpian version of John McCain. I like a Messiah who's not captured. Sorry, just had to throw that in there. Why not? Because they don't. Because there aren't any good arguments for it. If there were, they'd convert. Everybody would. If it was obvious, we'd all be Christians. All right, so it's a different kind of belief system, religion, than other forms of knowledge. It's not reliable, justifiable knowledge in the same way as other knowledge claims are. It very much depends on a whole other host of factors that are not based in evidence and empiricism and reason, but other things that I'll address in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Luke, you're going to do a 10-minute rebuttal before we go into some Q&A. Just a reminder, feel free to text in those questions and we'll try and include as many as we can after Luke's finished speaking.
I think I'll try to address the most relevant objections at this point, and then perhaps, as Michael indicated, we can talk through some of these other things in the informal section. Perhaps I'll begin by just addressing this idea. You have extraordinary claims, but you need extraordinary evidence. I do think that the evidence for Jesus' miracles is extraordinary. It's extraordinarily weighty. That was the point of my opening statement. I don't actually think this is a good slogan, though, even to begin with. I mean, many atheists also believe extraordinary things, don't they? That life came from non-life, unguided, right? Consciousness from non-consciousness, the universe from nothing, or from a multiverse, whatever. Now, those aren't the issues up for debate tonight, but certainly those are extraordinary claims. But there's no good evidence to think they're true, let alone extraordinarily good evidence. Beyond this, I think the objections Michael has to my case generally miss my point. So, for example, Michael mentions that people die for lies all the time. I agree with that, right? The Muslim jihadists, they did die for a lie, but there's a significant distinction there. In one case, people are dying for what they believe, because it's something they were taught, right? In another case, in the disciples of Jesus, they died for something they experienced publicly as adults, right? That also sets apart very powerfully Michael's illustration with Bob from Jesus and the apostles. We're not talking about a lone event that could be explained by some kind of hallucinogenic mushrooms, right? These weren't floating around in first century Galilee while Jesus was doing these public miracles. And what kind of miracles did he do? Ones that were public and verifiable. We have multiple witnesses, independent witnesses, individuals who are willing to change their lives and die for that. Now, if Michael can produce a parallel like that, my faith would be shaken, right? Because that's the key. It's that kind of evidence. That's what it would take to try to match the evidential basis for Jesus' miracles. Beyond this, there's something I would really like to talk about if I had a chance with Michael, which is the gospel writers. Michael claims that the majority of scholars think they're anonymous. Obviously, if they were, that would severely undermine my case. And perhaps I'll give a few indicators why I certainly don't think they were, and then I'd love to develop this more in our discussion, because I know for many of you, that's probably a big deal to you, right? You've based, well, let's face it, your eternity on what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell you. So we should probably cover that ground pretty well. Let me just give you a few positive reasons why I take the gospel account seriously. I'll start with just a little fun piece of internal evidence. Right? Internal evidence is just stuff within the document that seems to confirm its claims. Right? If that's going on, that's a good sign. That's something authentic. So, for example, you take the word thalasai. This is the Greek word for seed. Right? In Mark and in Matthew and in John, they love to talk about this 13-mile-long lake as the sea par excellence, right? Hathalas. This is their sea. And then there's Luke. And Luke refers to it as, well, the Lake of Tiberias, right? Now, why would one author call it the Lake of Tiberias and these three authors strangely call it the sea par excellence? Well, that's strange, but a natural, obvious explanation is that Luke was the guy who we've always thought he was. He's a Mediterranean Gentile. To him, it's a pond. And then you can take guys like Peter, who's behind Mark's gospel, or Matthew or John. Well, two of those three were fishermen. This is where they spent their lives. If you spent your life on that lake, that was to you the sea par excellence. So you take a little piece of information like that, right? You can look at it, and it's a piece of internal evidence. Now, the external evidence for the gospel writers, being who we think they are, is incredibly strong, right? It's uniform among the early church fathers. The manuscript evidence is uniform from the beginning. That's powerful evidence. That's important because we have to establish these were the individuals who really did experience Jesus and really did die for the things they came to believe. I have a few more minutes, so let's talk about this idea of mythology. If you want to try to argue that somehow the gospel writers were influenced by mythology, you get massive problems historically, right? First of all, Palestinian Jews, right? There's zero evidence they were influenced by mythology, right? There's absolutely no evidence to support that claim. They were obsessed with one book, the Old Testament for us, the Hebrew Bible, right? The New Testament it's filled with quotations about that, but nothing from pagan sources. In fact, the Jews, even in Galilee, were incredibly hostile to Hellenism, so like the influences from the Greek world, like their mythologies. So for example, in that area, that was a unique place where the Romans said, hey, let's not print any more coins, let's not make any more coins with the pictures of emperors on them. Why? Because those crazy Jews think they're like, some kind of evil paganistic idolatry, and let's not do that. That's unique to that area. Why? Because they strongly resisted Hellenism and Hellenistic influences, right? So you have to construct a view that ignores all the evidence to think they had borrowed from mythology. Now, if all Michael's saying is there's parallels to the story, well, that's actually maybe an evidence that it's true. And maybe that sounds strange to you. There's a guy named C.S. Lewis. Who here knows of C.S. Lewis? Read C.S. Lewis? I know Michael's read all of C.S. Lewis's works, right? He was actually a historian. He was not a historian, but he was a student of mythology. This was his love. He loved mythology. And he realized in all these separate mythological stories, there were these pictures of kind of like the hope of humanity expressed in an individual figure. Not historically. Mythology was never seen as history during this time that they're writing about Jesus. But these ideas of hope, resurrection, redemption, life after death, that there's more to life, right? We experience that as human beings. And C.S. Lewis said, hey, this is a story I see across all humanity. But here in this one point in time, that story seems to have become history. And it was actually that realization that made C.S. Lewis realize Jesus didn't just fulfill Old Testament Jewish prophecies. That's a discussion we can have in detail. Jesus actually fulfilled the hope of every human heart. And it was that realization that actually led Lewis to become a Christian, right? So the parallelism to any mythology that we have doesn't necessarily undercut the historicity that I've been discussing. Perhaps, as I'll wrap up here, and we could talk a little bit perhaps in our discussion about how memory might influence the gospel writing. In fact, I have some time to do that. Maybe I'll address that now. In order to make the claim that faulty memory would undermine the historicity of the Gospels, right, you'd have to believe they misremembered quite a bit, especially since 40% of the earliest Gospel is miracle. Well, there's a modern study done. It was published by Robert McIver in the context of the eyewitnesses of Jesus about how trustworthy memory is, and it was unique over in British Columbia. There was a violent crime. Right? Worst case scenario for good memory, by the way, whenever there's weapon focus or a quick event like that, that's where your eyewitness memory is the worst, right? Because it's an intense situation. Well, in this situation, there were 13 witnesses. It happened quickly, and because of the unique situation, there were researchers. They went in And they asked these people, hey, what do you remember about all these details? They went over 17 to 95 details in total, 13 witnesses. The next day, their memory was about 82% correct, which is pretty good. And then they witnessed them after a long period of time, 3 months, and you know what? It dropped to 81%. In other words, sure, people make mistakes about, especially in certain situations, about lighting, about names, right? About what day it is. And I'm pretty forgetful sometimes, especially today, being stressed out. I remembered, I misremembered about 20 things. I didn't stop remembering who my wife was, right? That's the kind of level where they'd have to misremember the miracles of Jesus, right? That's not the kind of level we misremember. In fact, for those kind of situations that change our lives, that are meaningful, that are personal, those are our best memories because they form who we are as people, right? Those are lasting. Those are the kind of memories you live for and the kind of memories I've been arguing you die for. Right? Maybe I'll, as I wrap it up, Michael mentioned a few issues he has with the Bible, the Inquisition, maybe it leads Christians to do bad things, and perhaps we'll kind of tack on to that whole Michael-Bob scenario, right? Let's say I'll just close my talk with a question for Michael. Let's say they're driving back to Seattle tonight, right? And
Oh boy, here we go.
Here we go. They're driving back to Seattle, all right? And what do you know? Their car breaks down, all right? In fact, at the same time, Bob is really stressed out. He has a heart attack and Bob's dead. There's Michael. I know, it's a little bit tragic. It'll end on a good note. There's Michael. He's in an alley in Seattle in the dark with a broken down car and a dead guy, all right? Now, down the alley is a group of giant men coming his way, right? Big guys. This is my question to Michael, if he thinks the Bible is so horrible and bad. Would you or would you not be happy to learn they had just come from a Bible study?
Right. Great stuff. Well, what a great set of opening statements and rebuttals. Thank you both, Luke and Michael, for those. Really interesting, really entertaining as well. Okay, so we're coming to a time when we're going to just have some open discussion between the three of us, and we'll throw in as many questions. Do we have some questions? Is anyone going to pass me a sheet from any that have... Well, I'll wait for someone if they do come up with any. They may pass me some, but it looks like someone's bringing some now. Okay. So, do you want to answer the question? Would that...
Poor Bob.
Would that be a good... I mean, we're really sorry about Bob, but...
I didn't really necessarily have to kill him off in my story. I don't know why I did that. Just spur of the moment. Sorry, Bob.
I mean, it was only a minor part of what you were saying, obviously, the question of the fact that Christians have been responsible.
The radio host, Dennis Prager, has asked me this.
Yes.
He asks everybody this question. He asked Christopher Hitchens this question, and Hitch rattled off the number of cities he'd been around in the world where he would definitely prefer they not be coming from a religious gathering. And I'd have to agree with that. Depends on the religion. Okay, is a Christian church in Seattle? Yeah, okay, I'm sure that'd be fine. But, it depends, of course.
Of course.
On the context. I do want to say something about the mythology is an interesting topic I've been thinking a lot about recently as I've gotten to know Jordan Peterson a little bit. Maybe you've heard of Jordan Peterson. He's become pretty famous public intellectual now. And it's not clear that he's a Christian or not. Christians seem to think he is. They want him to be. Not 100% sure he is.
He's hard to pin down on the important things.
I've had him on this very show, The Unbelievable Show.
You did? Yes.
And
What do you
asked him that question. He said, I live my life as though I'm a Christian.
Okay. All right. Well, okay.
Which, again, is kind of difficult to pin down. So.
Well, let's think about that, because he says, like the resurrection. Okay, what does this mean? Well, it represents the suffering of life, and life is hard, and you have to bear your burden, you have to bear your cross. So get up in the morning, make your bed, clean your room, work hard, and face your demons with courage and so on. It's like, yeah, okay, I'm behind all that. I make my bed, I clean my room, I work out every day, I face my demons. Yes, I'm right on board with you. But that's different than saying, did somebody actually die and come back to life? From a scientist's perspective, that's a separate question. So when we talk about mythology, are we talking about, empirical truths or metaphorical truths. So someone like Nietzsche or Jane Austen, Shakespeare, great novelists, they write about human truths about human nature and society and good and evil, and they touch deep truths that we gather information from. That's separate from, say, a scientific book or something saying these are the 6 characteristics of human nature or whatever. So it depends what we mean by mythology when we talk about that.
What you brought up to some extent, this whole issue towards the end of C.S. Lewis talking about the mythology that exists and how he sort of came to understand Christ as the true myth, the historical myth, the myth coming true, as it were. So in that sense, I guess Lewis was saying it's more than just a meaning or a psychological kind of truth. It's something deeper than that, presumably.
Yeah, from Richard Swinburne's book, I think Bradley Bowen cited that work. He talks a little bit about that and this idea of mythology and how it developed, and also Gregory Boyd talks about it in the Jesus legend. And they both point out that historically speaking, there are really 2 different ways to understand mythology. One way is to say, mythology is something fabricated, like it's made up, right? And in that sense, of course, I don't think Christianity is mythology, because I think it's historical. Another way, and this is actually the more traditional Greek way, is the idea of it's an unveiling of something that's beyond, like universal, right? The kind of universal things we tend to live for, that's something else, right? And it might wrap up certain ideas, like the kind of stuff that Jordan Peterson might want to highlight. And I think in that sense, Christianity is the ultimate myth that actually became true in history. In that sense, it's the unveiling of the universal truths found in God that we all tend to reach out for. And if we believe in Jesus, a little evangelistic plug here, if you believe in Jesus, we find.
Can I throw a question to you, Michael? And this came from someone in the audience. Said, is there any context in which you would believe a miracle claim? And I've got a little request as well. I read a fascinating story you wrote about the thing that came closest to being a miracle. It involved a faulty radio set. And you might want to share that, because it's just an interesting story.
Yeah, so it's a good question that we should ask each other. What would it take to change your mind?
Absolutely.
Or falsify your belief? You mentioned a hint of it there in your rebuttal that if there were other historical parallels. I thought I provided one reasonably close with Muhammad. In Islam, although he didn't claim to be the son of God, so yes, you're going to find differences, but that seemed like a pretty good argument. And I've talked to a lot of Muslims. I've had them at my office with film crews, telling me this is absolutely the gospel. Their gospel, and I remain unconvinced still. So there's that. The problem.
Would you like me to answer that now?
Yeah,
or?
Well, yeah.
Sure. Feel free. I do want to get to the question of what would convince you, if anything.
Okay. Well, let me just, because I forgot to address that, so I'm glad you brought it up. So the key difference for me would be, once again, to go back to the history. So as my case demonstrated, what's important for me is eyewitness memory, right? Living memory. These are the guys who really actually knew Jesus, these guys who lived and died for this. That's key for me. So with Muhammad, for example, in the Hadith, you're talking about like 100, 150-year gap. That's the difference for me. So it's one thing to say a guy performed miracles, and our earliest sources are distant, right? And the very earliest sources in the Quran don't have any kind of miracles in that sense. That's very different than saying, here's the Jesus tradition. At the very core, we didn't address this, but actually at the very core, the very earliest Jesus tradition is actually about his resurrection, from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. And many skeptical scholars, including Bart Ehrman, Gerd Ludemann, John Dominic Crossan, date that proclamation that Paul quotes about the resurrection of Jesus and Jesus appearing to James and to Peter, some of the guys I mentioned. That core, according to these skeptical scholars, and of course the evangelical scholars, goes back to within 1 to 3 years of Jesus' death. I look at that and I say, that is early, that is living memory, that is convincing. That to me is a totally different world than saying, here are some miracles 150 years later in the Hadith. Right? That's very different. That's where I would draw that distinction.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah. So, for example, Bart Ehrman, you mentioned Bart. He makes the point that when Matthew talks about the virgin, the virgin birth, he was operating from a Greek translation of the book of Isaiah, but the original Hebrew book of Isaiah doesn't say virgin; it says young maiden, or if you want to loose it a little bit, that it was a woman who was a virgin, then she was going to have a son who would be Emmanuel and special and so on. Well, of course, in fact, you start off as a virgin and then you have a child, you're no longer a virgin. I mean, had sex, so that changed it. So anyway, Bart's point is that he thinks, and not just him, but a lot of biblical scholars, that the gospel writers, whoever they were writing theology, not history. They were sort of tying up the loose ends from the Old Testament to make it fit what they thought the story should be, which would be much like the prequel to Star Wars tying up the loose ends in this original Star Wars movie, because the writers are writing to have a coherent narrative arc thread there. This is
and is that your view of what's happening with all the miracle stories in the Gospels as well?
Maybe,
There's
maybe
a
some of them,
theological,
yeah.
rather than a historical
I don't quite like this characterization as liars or fools. That's too black and white. It's too not nuanced enough about human nature. People are genuinely, honestly trying to understand the world, and they just misunderstand or misperceive. We know this happens. And they're not lying. They're not idiots or fools. Neither one of those is quite right.
What is happening in your view then?
Well, okay, so if you're going to apply any of those criteria, then why not accept the Fatima story about 50,000 people saw the sun stop and tumble to 50,000? That's not like one person, on magic mushrooms. If you're going to apply that standard, why would you not accept that? Or maybe you do, I don't know.
A couple of things then to respond to there, Luke, briefly. So is it just a theological account, them kind of trying to make a theological point and inventing things like virgin births and whatever?
Okay.
And yeah, what about those other kind of claims that people have said, well, thousands of people saw the miracle of Fatima and so on?
Well, starting with the virgin birth idea and the fact that there seems to be, according to Michael, perhaps a weak prophetic link there, right? Is it even fulfilling this, or did Matthew reinterpret what the Old Testament text said? I mean, if that was the case, actually, for me, if I just step out of I'm an inerrantist, so that's just a position I hold. I step out of that and I take just a strictly historical view. That wouldn't undermine my key point that they experienced a radical person named Jesus who changed their world. Because if anything, what that's saying is, here's Matthew, and he believes Jesus was born of a virgin for other reasons, and then he goes back and he tries to make the Old Testament text mix with that. So if it points to anything from a critical perspective, it does point back to the core of something experienced, right? And so that would be my off the top of my head, one response I might take. As far as the apparitions of all kinds in general, I do think there are certain situations, and this is what the published literature has revealed, where it is less easy to conclude that a miracle has happened, and issues that would actually influence how we interpret those things miraculously. So, for example, something very distant, something very vague, something that could be interpreted different ways, something that is expected, right? So especially like the Roman Catholic apparitions, they expected to see this. It was in an environment where they were almost waiting for that kind of vision. And I think when you just take those kind of criteria and you take it back to the miracles of Jesus, that's where the liars and fools things comes in for me. The kind of things they experienced, right, were against what they expected culturally. In fact, during that time, the Messiah, that's who they claimed Jesus was, wasn't even expected to be a miracle worker, right? And when they have someone they experienced up close and personal, they knew, they were in the inner circle, they talked with him, right? They walked with him. That to me is in a different category than a distant vision or apparition. Maybe they did see something out there, right? Now, I don't have to agree. I can agree with that and say I don't agree with their interpretation of that. I think that's much more difficult to do with the disciples of Jesus because the relationship is so close and real to the actual events. It's so personal. So I would draw that distinction between those.
I think to answer your original question, what would it take me to change my mind
let's do that.
on a miracle would be something not just highly improbable, but that just could not have happened naturally. So, for example, when people tell me stories about cancers that went into remission after they prayed, okay, what about all the people that were Christian and prayed and their loved ones died anyway? The problem of evil and all that. But cancers do go into remission periodically. So you got to know the whole data set and the long tail of highly improbable 4 standard deviations out from the mean of survival rate of pancreatic cancer or whatever. But turns out 1 out of 1 million people with stage 4 pancreatic cancer last 10 years. and your guy lasted 8 years.
I need to
It's all right.
introduce you to a guy called Dr. Sean George, because he would love to talk to you about some
okay,
statistics.
all right.
But we had him on earlier on.
Something that would never happen. And so here's our example of this, a amputee growing a new limb.
Okay.
All right?
So would that be something, if
That
you saw that
yeah.
happen?
Now, assuming David Copperfield wasn't in the room, because I've seen Penn and Teller walk on water. I've seen Penn and Teller change water into wine. I've even seen them raise the dead. Right. Teller is in this water tank and he drowns while Penn's trying to find the card in the deck and he can't find it and Teller drowns.
But if you could be shown categorically,
yeah, there was
nothing dodgy
and not just
going
me. But you and all of us,
sure.
and there it is. It's a wounded warrior back from Iraq or Afghanistan, blown up in an IED, missing his limbs. He's a Christian and so on. They pray over him and the limb just grows back. We got it on video. Everybody could see it. Okay.
You'd be in church the next day. Okay. So
I'd be impressed.
You'd be impressed. I did want to hear this story.
Oh, the story of the radio.
Yeah, the story of the radio. Tell us that story, because I just think that would be an interesting segue into what counts and what doesn't count.
Yeah, so this is one of these highly improbable events. It probably has a natural explanation. Who knows? I don't care. But for almost 18 years, I had a monthly column in Scientific American. So for one of them, I wrote about this unusual event on my wedding day. My wife's from Cologne, Germany, and she was raised by a single mom. And so as we were dating and deciding, we're going to be together, she's shipping stuff out to California from Germany. And so one of them included this radio from her grandfather. So she was raised by a single mom and her grandpa. So it was this little 1977 Philips transistor radio, and she loved this. And I tried to get it to work, and it was dead. And I put new batteries in, and I did the old, that usually works. And I did nothing. And anyway, so then she moved to California to be with me, which I still can't believe. Anyway, and so then we decided to get married, and we went to the Beverly Hills courthouse, and then we did a thing at my house in Altadena at the time, and just had friends and family over. It was just a last-minute thing. Let's just do it. And so she had nobody there, so she was feeling pretty bad about this. Like, I have nobody here. It's just you and your family. And so she needed a moment alone, so we go back into the back bedroom, and we hear music playing. So, and I don't have a stereo system. I didn't have a stereo system in my house. I thought, well, I must have left my laptop with iTunes open. No. Was it no, it wasn't the phone. And then it's like, is it the neighbors? No, it seems to be coming from the drawer where I put this radio. Anyway, bottom line, I pull the drawer out, and there's the radio, and it's on, and it's playing, perfectly tuned to a station, playing this beautiful, I don't even remember what the song was, playing beautiful love music. And, Jennifer is like, oh my God, no, she's an atheist. She doesn't think, grandpa's floating around, and whatever. But here's the point, and I wrote about this, and I said, I have no explanation for it. It was particularly emotionally poignant and meaning for us, and that's what love is all about, is finding those kind of connections between people and remembering your loved ones and so on. And of course, I got deluged with mail. Oh, Shermer, it's the transistor or the capacitor of the blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, maybe there is a natural explanation, maybe, but the timing and the dialed right in, and we let it play all night. The next day, the radio went dead. And it's been dead ever since. I do the bam, and put new batteries in, still doesn't work. And so again, I'm not just like saying I'm no longer the Mr. Skeptic, and I now think ghosts and ESP and psychics and the whole thing is real. No, but there is a lot we can't explain. There's a lot of anomalies and mysteries nobody has an answer for, and it's okay to just say, I don't know. It's all right.
Okay. Such an interesting story. Thank you for sharing it. I don't know if you want to respond to that story, but certainly the issue of what it would take to convince Michael. What do you think about his sort of level of evidence? Okay, don't give me your remission stories. Don't give me that stuff happens. Show me something like an arm growing back, a limb growing back.
Yeah, well, I wonder, maybe I'll start with a question there. Has your level changed? Because I've recently listened to your podcasts, and in the past, it seemed like you were indicating that you can imagine any kind of evidence that would cause you to believe.
Sometimes it depends on
your mood.
It depends on what we're talking about. Now, miracle would be slightly different than, say, does God exist?
Okay.
Like Woody Allen's famous line, because he's an atheist Jew, and what would it take? He said, a large cash deposit in a Swiss bank account under my name, $10 million, that'll do it. Again, I'm not 100% sure. It would have to be something along the lines of a miracle, some evidentiary thing.
Yeah.
Because we don't know the origins of the universe yet. There might be multiple universes. There was maybe something before the Big Bang that caused it to be. We just don't know. So there, I just say, I don't know.
Yeah.
At some point, we shift from science to kind of metaphysics or whatever, religion, something. We just don't. We just hit an epistemological wall where we just don't know.
Yeah.
And you have your answers, and theoretical physicists have their answers that are, if they're not testable, they're not physics. It's not science. It's sort of whatever it is. Speculation. So the God question, I'm not sure. And here's why. Because if you define God as really truly omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, it can't just be a super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence that's able to, say, genetically engineer life forms or whatever, because we can practically do that with just a century of technology. And so say you had 50,000 years of the rate of technological growth and science growth we've had, any sufficiently advanced extraterrestrial or far future human would be indistinguishable from what we think of as God. So your God, as I conceive of it, because I used to believe in this God, would have to be different than that. Not just a material, natural being that's super smart.
Okay.
So outside of space and time. Okay, if God is outside of space and time, how can I access him?
Okay. Through Jesus.
What?
Right, you're talking to a Christian, right? Well, perhaps.
So, but what your point is that periodically God reaches in to stir the particles. In this case, okay. Now here we have a problem. Was Jesus, this is a legitimate debate. Was Jesus always God and then just came down and became man for a while? But that's not what not all the gospel writers think that. Some think he became God when he was baptized.
Oh, you're reading that into the text.
Birth, baptized, or when he was resurrected, or Luke, or John thinks he was always God for eternity.
I think they all.
I think the other gospel writers think he became God when he was either born, baptized, or resurrected.
Quick response on Christology.
Well, there's a lot there. So let me just go back to the beginning. Perhaps you shared your story, and then you mentioned the cash deposit into the account. And so perhaps I'll give a little anecdote myself, and then I will try to address why I think at least the miracles of Jesus don't lend comfortably to the future alien explanation, if I can call it that. So I'll tell you a little anecdote, a little story. I know this is not very scientific, but I know a guy, and he wouldn't want me to tell you the story actually, but he grew up as a nominal Christian or an atheist by any means, right? And spent his whole life just focused on the world, right? Focused on making money, right? That kind of stuff. Grew up as a skeptic. In his 40s, certain kinds of evidence began to challenge him. Namely, Christians that he met, and they seemed intelligent, and they seemed reasonable, and he thought these people aren't idiots, right? They're not fools. And so he started to look for the evidence. Now, part of that process was actually something very unorthodox, and this kind of goes into the somewhat parallel to Michael's story, although there's a religious context here. He prayed a prayer to God, not a prayer I would advise anyone to pray. One night he said, God, if you are real, I'm searching for you, okay? He was big in the stocks, very wealthy, retired when he was 40 years old. Said, if you're real, if you help me make a whole bunch, this is not a very good prayer. If you help me make a whole bunch of money this week, I will take the next step into seeking you more. All right? And that week, he made $40,000 in the stock market, while everyone else lost money, right? And actually did lead him to become a Christian. I know that because that guy's my dad, right? And now the point of that story is,
so he's a short trader.
I do have certain stocks I'd like you to invest in now. Then we'll take it out.
But he's a short trader. He bet this market would go down, and he made money. There's people that do that.
Well, of course, I'm saying what I'm saying is that I do think when we are open to entering into a deeper relationship with God, and we're serious about that, obviously it shouldn't take this particular kind of situation. That's not recommended. But I do think for those who are open to the evidence, God provides enough evidence for those individuals to believe. But I also think the alternative is true as a Christian, because I believe in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus, for example, taught in parables. Not because we love stories and we understand it better, but Jesus' reasoning was, I'd teach them in parables So that those who are really interested in seeking, wanting to go deeper, will go deeper and find me in that. And those who aren't interested can just go their other way, right? And I think at the bottom of my issue with the amputee desire, right, is that it assumes something of God that I don't think the Christian God would ever want to give if Christianity is true. In fact, I think it involves at least 3 assumptions I simply disagree with, right? One of those is, well, if God were good, right, then he would take away all of our pain. Now, if we live in a sin-cursed world, right, maybe it's God's desire to, through our free choices, to use pain to draw us into his kingdom. And this was actually the testimony of my grandparents, who also grew up as non-Christians, and my grandma got a brain tumor, and through that experience, my grandparents both became Christians. My grandpa became a radical evangelist. What I'm saying is, God isn't about just making all of our illnesses go away. In fact, I think if God started to heal all amputees, the result of that would just be a health and wealth gospel, which is the very thing Jesus wouldn't want us to believe, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first assumption. Perhaps I can finish. The second assumption that I think is simply incorrect is that if God were real, he would have to do miracles in the past like he does today. And I think if you take the Christian worldview and you follow the biblical evidence, even in the scriptures, you only see these kind of instantaneous, complete, undeniable miracles in certain phases of what we call redemption history. Because the point of these miracles in the Exodus and in the time of Jesus was to solidify a particular message. That was really a message about risk and choice and love and holiness, right? The kind of things that would, I think, be undermined by the kind of obvious miracle claims that Michael wants to believe in. But those are actually the kind of things that we find the most value with in our own lives. If I think about myself, one of the greatest risks I ever took was choosing to marry my wife based on less than extraordinary evidence, right? That was a risky choice. Best choice I ever made. Most meaningful choice I ever made. And I think at the end of the day, perhaps so I'm not going on and on, I'll wrap it up with this. I do think God wants something more for us than to think he exists like this table exists. I think if all that God wanted to do is to show us that he existed, he would go out and he would heal amputees. He would write, Michael Shermer, you're a great guy. I love you, Yahweh, out in the stars, right?
That would do it.
That would do it. Thank you, Michael. I just don't think that's the kind of God that exists if he's real. I don't think it's the kind of God I should expect if Jesus performed miracles.
But when a miracle does happen, when somebody's beloved mother or whatever, the cancer goes away, and they prayed and they give God credit, right? This happens a lot. Many of you had an experience where you prayed and something good happens and you thought God really intervened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this would be an example of this.
Yeah.
This didn't just happen 2,000 years ago. Most Christians think it happens all the time, but not all the time. So here's the problem. What about all the times you prayed and it didn't come out?
Yeah.
Well, God had a different plan for me. Okay. In other words, when something good happens, who gets the credit? God. When something bad happens, who gets the blame? Not God.
Well,
So you feel it's a tails you win, heads you lose kind of affair. And this is a common sort of objection. It's sometimes called confirmation bias as well. You know, every time we see something good happen, we say, yeah, God did it. And if it doesn't happen, we kind of ignore it or maybe make an explanation or something. And I can understand when Michael comes from that point of view, because I think there is a natural tendency maybe for us to want to see if we do have a particular belief that the good bit, the pros and rather than the cons.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I think on one level, I actually do kind of agree with Michael that answers to prayer, that's why I don't give my case for Christianity based on modern answers to prayer, because I do think it's simply such a difficult situation to determine when did God really do this, right? And if God, my mom had a brain aneurysm a year and a half ago. She's disabled, right? Why didn't God answer that prayer about my mom? And then my answer to that as a Christian, by the way, I think Christians do deeply struggle with God's existence and goodness when people suffer. I do think that's true, you know, and we're not that easy letting God off the hook, I think. I think there's a wrestling that goes on there. But I do think it's more complicated. And I do think, in a sense, I think you're right, Michael. I don't think we should attribute our subjective experiences of how God has answered our prayers for something like the validity of Jesus' miracles too easily and too readily. And that's why, for example, with Dr. Sean George, you know, we didn't fly him out here to have him talk about his miracle story just because it was an answer to prayer. There were certain other factors involved there wasn't a naturalistic explanation. And it happened to take place in a deeply religious context. And we grilled him for like an hour and a half. Maybe at the end of the day, there were even some Christians who thought, I'm still not sure about that, right? And what I want to say is, that is, as powerful as this story is, I put the miracles of Jesus on a different plane. And that's the case I came out with tonight. And I think one of the reasons is because there is that confirmation bias element of prayer. So in a way, I almost want to agree with him.
Can we go to another question? The first question I posed was you, Michael. There's actually three questions, all really similar for you, Luke. And I think this is an important one. Part of your case was built on the fact that those early followers of Jesus were willing to die for this faith. Now, a few people mention this. One person says, Christian tradition has Peter crucified upside down, but scholars don't simply accept such traditions uncritically. Do scholars agree that it is an established historical fact? What's the evidence? And other people ask, why do you think the claims of martyrdom are true? And another asks, do scholars agree that Jesus' disciples died as martyrs, as historical facts? So I think people are just looking for, okay, great to hear those stories. Do we have good evidence that these people really did die for their faith?
Yeah, I'll recommend a book before I answer. Sean McDowell, who's been on your show, he did his PhD on this and went into the historical evidence behind the claims about martyrdom for the early apostles. So I take Peter, for example. Clement of Rome, writing at the end of the first century, notes that Peter and Paul were martyred, right? And he's a very early source. In fact, for Peter's death, you have John chapter 21, which actually seems to foreshadow Peter's death by crucifixion quite clearly, right? And there are two options. Either it's prophetic, if you're a Christian and you think that's part of John's original gospel, or it's put in later, like at the end of the first century. Either way you take that account, it's evidence that it's significant evidence for the truth of Christianity. Either it's a real prophecy and Peter died that way, or this happened and then it was put in the text, it was interpolated later. Beyond that, we have Irenaeus. He's a disciple of John, or rather he's a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. And we have Clement of Alexandria. That's Peter's death. And you can make similar cases for example, the death of Paul or the death of James. Those three are very concrete historically. And then you have later embellishments of that, like Peter being crucified upside down. Probably not. That's just a later embellishment. You can tell, even by the fact that it's a strange story, by the way, right? That would be a hint that this is actually a later edition. It's fantastical, right? And because it's later, that I wouldn't trust that, but I would trust what's multiply attested in early sources.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that particular?
When I was at Pepperdine University as an undergraduate, I was originally going to major in theology. Mainly wanted to be a college professor because it seemed like a great gig. You get summers off, and theology was my thing because I was a born again Christian at the time, and so I took courses in, as you know, in the writings of C.S. Lewis, the Life of Jesus, the New Testament, the Old Testament, and so on. But to be a college professor, you have to have a PhD. To have a PhD in theology, you have to master Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, and Latin, and I could barely get through Spanish. So I realized, oh boy.
It's rough going.
It's pretty rough going, I guess, as you know. But I also realized taking these courses, you really need to read, the Hebrew, not the King James version or whatever. You really got to read the original, as old as we can get, because those words, much turns on how those words are translated and what they originally meant in the context they were used. Boy, you could get lost into the weeds of this whole business of, which gospel and who said what and how it was translated and so on. And anyway, I haven't looked at a lot of that material in a long time. I took some of Bart Ehrman's courses, the teaching company courses. They're great. I feel like listening to him that he's trying to present it fairly, like this is what some theologians say. These are other here. It seems that way to me, but maybe you don't feel that way. But anyway, my point is this, that at least some of this stuff is clearly debatable amongst just within Christian theologians. Christians who are agreed, Jesus is my Savior, I accept him, and so on. We're right on the same page there. But you and I disagree on that passage right there and how you interpret that word. That has to be okay to have those discussions.
And I think that kind of interchange does happen on exactly the kind of scenario you're describing. What is that particular word, right? But not, for example, the martyrdoms of Peter, right? And sometimes, too, the linguistics of a particular text, if you understand that, it can actually add to your view of its authenticity. So, for example, I didn't even mention Josephus's account of Jesus' miracles. Josephus, the Jewish first century historian, also mentions that Jesus is a miracle worker, right? and there's discussion about that particular text, one of the reasons I didn't bring it up, that maybe this is a later Christian interpolation, for example. Okay, and Josephus calls Jesus a doer of marvelous works. Now, if you understand the Greek there, for example, okay, what Josephus is calling Jesus is actually paradoxon orhon poietes, right? And what's interesting is paradoxon, that's actually uniquely Josephus's way of referring to a miracle. It's a paradox, right? But what do the biblical writers, the Christians, always call Jesus' signs? Semeion or teros. They're signs or they're works of God. So that's just one illustration of how understanding the text actually shows this text from Josephus, when he's talking about Jesus' miracles, is actually very likely originating with Josephus, because he uses what we call Josephus' idiolect, Josephus' word. Whereas if a later Christian would be interpolating that text, they would use, obviously, the Christian language. And so for me, and this has been my experience going into scholarship, the more you dig into the roots of this, it continues to strengthen the case that there were many multiple witnesses to Jesus, and it doesn't undermine that.
Let me pose a question to you, Michael. One person asks, aren't you effectively saying miracles can't happen, so they don't happen? Are you kind of saying from the outset, they can't happen, therefore, whatever you think happened, it wasn't a miracle?
Okay, so, I gave an example of what it would do for me,
Sure.
what it take to change your mind, so no, not quite. On the other hand, we would always be curious to know, well, how did the limb grow back? Because we know salamanders can do this, so there's a genomic sequence that can happen that causes cells to turn on and start multiplying and growing into that particular limb structure. This happens embryologically in fetuses. It can happen. We know it can happen. We've seen it. How did it happen? I'd be curious to know. How did God do this?
Okay.
I mean, did God reach into the limb? Or if it's God cured the cancer, did he go into the tumor? Well, now we have this virus you can inject into tumors. This is how Jimmy Carter is still alive. They injected this virus, his polio virus, into his brain tumor. And it reprogrammed the cells to die, just the tumor cells and not the surrounding cells in his brain. Okay, is that what God does? Something like that?
Well, you live with a woman, right, Michael?
I live with a woman?
Yeah, you're married, right?
Last time I checked.
Oh, what I'm saying, we both live with things we don't
understand. That was
last
night,
right? I believe in love. I don't understand that, right?
Okay. Oh, no, wait a minute. Okay. You know what you call love without evidence? Stalking. Okay, you got to have some evidence. Something's got to be coming back.
I agree. My point is, as a Christian, I'm content believing that Jesus can perform miracles, and I'm content not being able to understand exactly why. That to me seems just completely logical and reasonable. If Jesus is who he said he was, he's God incarnate, right? If he created the universe, right? I'm like an ant compared to him, right? I wouldn't expect an ant walking across my lawn to understand physics, right? In the same way, I don't think I have to understand how God does something in order to believe that he does something, right? I go to the dentist. I expect them to fill my cavity. I trust them to do that. I have no idea how they do that, right? I don't need to understand how they do that to trust them that they will. In the same way, I think with Jesus, you have all this evidence, and the evidence points to the fact that you can trust in him. I don't know how God does that, but I can still trust it based on the evidence that I have.
I think this is a good place to wrap up, and can we give a big round of applause to both of our guests?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to have a chance for just some final thoughts from you both.
Okay.
So we've just got 5 minutes apiece. If you want to use 5 minutes, you've got 5 minutes. Shall we go in the same order we began in? If you'd like to take the...
Oh, yeah, sure.
You can do it from your seat, or you can do it from the podium.
I'll just walk around. Yeah,
okay.
no, I mean, I have nothing prepared.
That's fine. Just some final reflections
I've kind of given my best lines.
On the debate, Michael.
I told my Catholic joke, and no, this rabbi, priest, and a minister walk into a bar, and the bartender goes, "What is this, a joke?"
Good one.
Okay. So, all right, I think it's highly improbable that Jesus' miracles are believable. To me, they're unbelievable. So, I mean, that was the debate point. Okay, why? Now, Let's talk about what is truth. Pilate famously asked Jesus, what is truth? He famously did not answer, or perhaps could not answer. So let's talk about truth. So there are different kinds of knowledge statements or claims that people make that we can try to determine if they're right or wrong or true or false or undecidable. If I say, there's 357 people here tonight, well, we can determine if this is true or false. Just count them up. On the other hand, if I say something like, dark chocolate is objectively better than milk chocolate. Now, I think I can prove this, but I have a feeling I can't really. It's more of a sort of an opinion. If I say, Stairway to Heaven is the greatest rock song of all time. Now, I know what you're saying. Freebird, yes, Freebird is great, but not as good as, okay. These are rather subjective claims that, cannot be verified. I don't know what's going on in your head or how you feel, the problem of other minds. I don't know what that is. If I took ayahuasca and discovered, as some of my fans want me to do, try the ayahuasca, you will see, Shermer, there is this whole other spiritual world there. This opens the doors of perception to this other world. Okay, let's say I did this. My wife absolutely insists I do not do this, by the way. I have to go to Costa Rica to do this and all this. Anyway, but let's say I did it, and I come back, I go, you're not going to believe it. I was completely wrong. There is this whole other spiritual world, and you too can find the truth about this if you just take the ayahuasca. Okay, now I think most of you would agree, yeah, no, probably not. It's probably just, a brain thing. It's twisting your neurons around, and you're having these hallucinations, right? Okay, so, as you kind of go through these different claims, then it gets a little fuzzier. I mean, then there's like political, quasi-religious type claim. I believe in a progressive tax. No, I believe in a regressive tax. How do we settle that? We vote. Okay, so I mean, there may not be objective truths in that sense. And so let's get to the point for tonight. So Jesus, was there somebody named Jesus? Yes, probably. I think from what I've read, yes, probably. Was he crucified? Probably. The Romans crucified everybody. Now, Bart makes the claim, by the way, or the observation, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, that the Romans did not put common thieves who were crucified into a known grave. They usually heaved them into an unknown pit or grave. So how would the disciples know where to go? Anyway, that's a separate question. And so those, I think, are historical questions we can answer and agree, or kind of largely agree, or most people agree, yes, lived, crucified. Was he resurrected, and did he die for our sins? Okay, did he die for our sins? To me, this is a purely religious, faith-based assertion that cannot be verified one way or the other. You either believe it or you don't. Now, the resurrection is kind of in the middle there. It's an actual a claim that 100 billion people have lived and died, and none of them have come back, but maybe one of them came back. Okay, what's the evidence for this probably most extraordinary claim ever made? And you heard that evidence, you heard Mike. So how do we decide on that? So for me, to return to my previous examples, the fact that Jews and Muslims, who are pretty close to you, especially Jews, don't accept the evidence, to me, not to mention Buddhists and Hindus and so forth, don't accept that, even when you present that to them, or they know the evidence. I don't think it's that good. I don't think it's clearly in the realm of objective knowledge, reliable knowledge, that we can clearly say, yes, these are reasons why I should believe that. I think it's more along the lines of, if you already believe, or you're committed to that faith tradition, and that's part of the tradition, and you accept it for that reason, that's fine. But it's not in the same category of this sort of objective knowledge, factual, checking, empirical type knowledge. I know this, just to give you two examples on your side, Ken Miller is a Catholic. He is one of the most famous biologists at Brown University. He was testified in the Dover creationism trial against the intelligent design creationists. They're wrong, and he shows why they're wrong. But he fully believes Jesus is the Savior. He was resurrected. He did die for his sins, our sins, and so on. And Francis Collins, another friend of mine, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health. He was the head of the Human Genome Project. He is a born-again Christian. He writes about this experience. When I press both of them, but is it true in this way, this empirical way, the same way you study the genome? Or no, it's just my faith tradition. That's it. Okay, then we can have mutual respect for each other. I acknowledge that. That's fine. But it's in a different kind of category. So that's how I think about these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Luke's going to bring us his final statement.
I'm going to go up here behind my podium because I usually talk in a church. It's just more comfortable. I really want to thank you, Michael, for coming out and having this discussion. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I've referenced this several times. I told you guys about the story with my dad, how he was pursuing evidence and he prayed this prayer to make a lot of money. And that's, of course, not the whole story. In fact, he prayed that prayer and said, God, if I do make money, I'll give every penny I have from it to charity. And he did that. And part of my faith is more than evidence. It's also seeing my mom and dad struggle through the difficulties of what that means for us as individuals. Becoming a Christian is a lot more like a relationship between a child and a father, right? Than it is like some kind of abstract idea. And I made my main case tonight on this single issue, historically. The earliest people who knew Jesus embraced the hardship of that relationship because of what they saw, because of the evidence. How far did they go? They committed all the way, right? They weren't liars. They weren't fools. They did believe in Jesus and suffer and die for him. And, you know, I'm making this cabin. I'm trying to make a little bit of money. I don't make a lot of money because I'm a part-time postgraduate student, part-time contractor, and trying to put a little Airbnb together. And I was talking to an insulator the other day, and he said, you know, I do this all the time. At night, I go on Netflix, and I just like scroll down to all the shows. I never make a decision. And then I get tired and I fall asleep, right? I heard a guy say, you know, that is the defining feature of this generation, right? Where we like keeping our options open, right? Open doors. And I want to say, life, it's kind of like a hallway with 1,000 doors, right? Nobody wants to be stuck behind a closed door. Right? That's kind of the mantra of our time. But nobody wants to live in a hallway either, right? I want to say perhaps the most radical thing one can do as a human being is to commit to one thing, to one person. And above all else, forego all other options, and you live completely and totally for that something. What I want to say is what Jesus' miracles provide is a context that's hard, right? It's a risk. It's a choice, right? But that is a choice worth making. And it's a choice based on excellent, early, extraordinary, weighty evidence. What I hope my case has done for you, if you're a Christian, is to take that choice you've already made and anchor it into history so that you can know as you suffer and walk with Christ, it won't be easy. That's not the world we live in, right? It'll be meaningful, it'll be strong, and you can endure that to the end. If you came here as a skeptic, I hope my case will challenge you. I do. I hope you'll actually read the Gospels as eyewitness accounts to the life of Jesus, right? That's been my desire tonight, is to come and give you this evidence. I want to thank you for taking the time to do that, as well as many of you who are here this afternoon. And it's my hope and it's my prayer that you will consider that radical act of committing to someone based upon good evidence. And you take the miracles of Jesus seriously for what they're worth, right? Which is weighty, authentic, life-changing. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Justin.
Well, thank you so much for spending the day with us today, for coming tonight, and look out for this on the Unbelievable podcast and the video feed as well. We'll be trying to get it out in the next couple of weeks' time. And all I simply is left for me to do is to say thank you once again to organizers, to Quilting Bible Church, and to everyone who's made today possible. Have a very safe journey home, and we'll see you another time. Thank you.
Thank you so much.